Hey, it's Dr. Ryan, and today we're going to talk a little bit about macronutrients. I've prepared a short presentation on how I approach macronutrients, and we're going to go through it together. So let's go ahead and get started. So what exactly are macronutrients? So macros, some people may refer to them as macros. Macronutrients are essentially nutrients that are required in large amounts for basic functioning of the body, primarily in energy production. There are three main types of macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And this is important to realize. Carbohydrates typically contain 4 kilocalories of energy per gram. We just refer to them as calories. Proteins contain 4 kilocalories per gram as well. And then fats contain 9 kilocalories per gram. And then when we're calculating calories for your diet, this will come into play. But notice how fats contain almost twice as much caloric intake, caloric energy than carbohydrates and fats. And that's something to consider when you're creating your diet. Okay, so what exactly are carbohydrates? Well, carbohydrates are primarily the macronutrient that's important for energy production. They're broken down to glucose, and there are a couple of types of carbohydrates. There's starchy carbohydrates and there's fibrous carbohydrates. Starchy carbohydrates are the ones that we are talking about that can be broken down to glucose, whereas fibrous carbohydrates really cannot be broken down by the body and are useful in GI regularity because they help with passage of human waste. And so starchy carbohydrates can be characterized further into both simple and complex. So simple carbohydrates would be things where you just have their carbohydrates consisting of primarily one glucose molecule or mono or disaccharide. So glucose or fructose, right? Or which are monosaccharides, or sucrose or maltose, which are disaccharides. Sucrose is glucose and fructose together. Maltose is 2 glucose molecules together. And generally, these carbohydrates usually taste sweet. They're things like honey, sugar, syrup, agave, molasses. Those would be the things that tend to be higher in simple carbohydrates. Now, milk and yogurt, they have a special type of carbohydrate called lactose, and that is primarily galactose, right? A combination of galactose, and they don't necessarily taste quite as sweet as the other types of saccharides, but they are considered simple. What about complex carbohydrates? So these are where you have strands of these sugar molecules that are strung together in large amounts, and these will, and we call these polysaccharides. And these you'll see in manifested as rice, pasta, bread, starchy vegetables such as potatoes and sweet potatoes, corn. Now, complex carbs usually contain fiber unless it's processed, right? So brown rice would be unprocessed complex carb versus white rice, which is processed, right? And generally, when they're processed, they tend to start to have some of the components of simple carbohydrates in terms of insulin release. More processed complex carbohydrates tend to cause spike insulin more so than less processed complex carbohydrates. And so ideally, and we'll get into this in a little bit, you want to try to focus on complex carbohydrates primarily for carbohydrate loading, as they don't seem to spike your insulin levels dramatically. What about proteins? Well, proteins are another macronutrient. They're essentially these large molecules consisting of amino acids. And these are really important in terms, they're the building blocks of enzymes, of proteins, which can consist practically everything within the cell, the cellular membrane, organelles. They're very, very important macronutrients. And they can consist of either non-essential or essential amino acids. So non-essential ones are amino acids that can be created by the body, whereas essential ones are ones that cannot be created by the body, need to be consumed from your diet. And generally, animal protein has all the essential amino acids. These are the things like milk, poultry, fish, and eggs. Whereas plant protein, you need to combine different types to get all of the essential amino acids. And one thing to remember is generally, unless it's an isolate, with plant protein, in order to get the combinations, you typically tend to have quite a bit of additional carbohydrates that are added. So you may, beans and rice might be a good combination to get all of your essential amino acids, but you're going to be eating a significant amount of carbohydrates to get that protein source. Whereas with animal protein, if it's lean and you don't add breading to it, of course, you can get primarily protein without added carbohydrate. And then fats. So these are really important in terms of energy storage, hormone production, and actually structural integrity within the cell membrane. And so there are several different types of fats that we're going to talk about each type here. The first one we're going to talk about are trans fats. So it may be good to go to this diagram first. So fatty acids are essentially just chains of carbon and hydrogen atoms kind of linked together. We call them hydrocarbons. Saturated fatty acids are where every carbon, it has two hydrogen bonds and then it's bound to another carbon. An unsaturated fatty acid is where there are double bonds between the carbon. So some of them don't have two hydrogen molecules here. They have a double bond here. And trans fatty acids are where hydrogen bonds are found on opposite sides of the carbon-carbon double bond. So how do you get trans fatty acids? Well, these are made by hydrogenating unsaturated fats. And why would you do that? Well, you can do this. This is actually done in industry to utilize unsaturated fats and make them solid at room temperature to be more marketable. You'll find them in margarine, shortening, doughs, fried foods. These are universally bad because they are definitely linked to a higher to poor lipid profile, so increased LDL and low HDL, and I would try to avoid these as much as possible. Saturated fat. So as we talked about, these are the fats where within the hydrocarbon chain, there aren't any double bonds between the carbon molecule, carbon atoms. And you'll typically find these in terms of animal sources, such as beef, lamb, pork, poultry, lard, full fat cheese, and dairy. This is controversial, but it appears they're probably not as healthy as unsaturated fats. And we're going to get into the types of unsaturated fats because there are some unsaturated fats that are definitely unhealthy. But if you were to compare them to healthy unsaturated fats, it's likely better to utilize unsaturated fats versus saturated fats for your fat in your diet. And what are the unsaturated fats? Well, again, these are fatty acids where there is at least one double bond between the carbon atoms, and there's monounsaturated fats where there's one double bond between the carbon atoms, and polyunsaturated fats where there's multiple. And typically they originate from plant sources. Some of them include avocado oil, nut oil, nuts and nuts butters, olive oil, and then of course certain fish like salmon, which are quite fatty. One thing to note is you want to avoid industrial seed oils. So basically these are unsaturated fats that are highly processed, and they come from things like corn, soybean, rapeseed, cottonseed, and safflower. And the reason why is during the process of creating them, they are heated, so they have very high oxidation. They are processed with, which in turn will lead to large amounts of inflammation within your body. They're processed with petroleum solvents, deodorizers, and colorants, essentially to make them more marketable and not smell, and which in turn are linked to inflammation within your body. And they tend to they have a very high, very unbalanced omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio. And this in turn is linked to inflammation too. You really want to have a 1-to-1 ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 or 2-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6. Whereas with many of these industrial seed oils, they tend to have a much higher omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, maybe 3-to-1 or 2-to-1 in favor of omega-6, which is not good. Okay, so we kind of talked about the macronutrients. Let's talk a little bit about body types. So classically, there are 3 ways to kind of describe your body at baseline: ectomorph, endomorph, or mesomorph. And what are some of the characteristics of these? Well, with an ectomorph, primarily these individuals have trouble gaining weight and tend to be very thin, lean. They have a fast metabolism, but and they've always had difficulty putting on weight, fat or muscle, throughout their teenage years into adulthood. Mesomorphs, on the other hand, these individuals tend to be fairly athletic. They have well-defined muscles. It's very easy for them to put on muscle mass, and they don't tend to gain fat very easily at all. But they do tend to gain weight much more easily than ectomorphs. And then you have endomorphs who at baseline tend to have a softer, rounder body. They tend to gain muscle but fat very easily. And you'll see these individuals have more of a stocky build. When it comes time for them to diet down, it's harder for them to lose fat, whereas a mesomorph can lose fat very easily and an ectomorph can lose it extremely easily. And owing to this, whereas they may have a significant amount of muscle, they're not very well defined. Okay, so based upon what your somatotype is, you would calculate your total caloric intake. So if you considered yourself endomorphic, you'd multiply your current body weight times 10 to get your caloric intake. If you're mesomorphic, you'd multiply it times 15. And if you're ectomorphic, you'd multiply it times 20. And these are some basic guidelines on where to get started. And then based upon that total amount, you would utilize the following percentages. Endomorphs tend to do very poorly with carbohydrates. You'd want to have less carbohydrates at baseline. So about 20% carbohydrates, 50% protein, 30% fats. Mesomorphs they have better insulin sensitivity. So 40, 40, 20, protein, carbs, fat seems to work better. And ectomorphs generally can do very well with carbohydrates. So something like 30, 50, 20 seems to work really, really well for those individuals. And how do we calculate this? Well, let's say you were an endomorphic patient, rounded body, you tend to gain fat easily, but gain some muscle, difficult for you to lose fat though. Okay, so let's say you're 200 pounds. So again, using that equation, 200 times 10, because you'd use that multiplier, would be 2,000 calories of your total amount of calories. And then what you would do is you would use the endomorphic macronutrient ratio, 50, 20, 30, and calculate the total amount of calories that are going to come from each one of these macronutrients. So 50% are going to come from protein. So 50% of 2,000 is 1,000 calories. 20% will come from carbs. So 400 calories will come from carbohydrates, and 30% will come from fats. So 600 calories will come from fats. Okay, so we have the caloric amounts. Now let's determine how much we have to get in terms of grams. And if you remember that that ratio that we talked about in the very beginning, 1 gram of protein is 4 calories, 1 gram of carbs is 4 calories, and 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. Remember, 1 gram of fat is about twice as much calories as carbs or protein. You'll be able to calculate the amount of grams of each of these macronutrients you need. So if you have 1,000 calories from protein, you divide that by 4, you have 250 grams of protein. If you have 400 calories from carbs, you divide that by 4, you have 100 grams of carbs. If you have 600 calories from fats, you divide that by 9, that's 66 grams of fats, right? And so these would be your macro amounts for the day. And what I usually do to make it very simple is I then take this and I divide it into 4 or 5 meals. Ideally, if you can, eating more frequently is likely to help with your metabolic rate, and you can digest better. So I usually try to aim towards 5. So something like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and 2 snacks in between. And if you divide it by 5, each meal would have 50 grams of protein, 20 grams of carbs, and 13.2 grams of fats. So you might be asking yourself, well, what do I do with this? How do I create a meal from this? Well, there are calorie counters out there that can help you establish what to include into each of these macros. Calorie King, MyFitnessPal, and Chronometer are some of my favorites, but there are many others. And basically, what you would do is you would find certain sources for each of these so that you meet these macro requirements. So for this particular meal, about 6 ounces of roasted chicken breast, 1 medium sweet potato, and 1.5 tablespoons of almond butter would be equivalent to the fats, carbs, and protein for this particular meal. Okay, so we kind of talked about what macronutrients are. We kind of talked about how to determine total caloric intake. We've kind of talked about how to create macros for your personal profile. But what about what foods to choose? Well, we kind of touched upon this when we talked about the macronutrients. For carb sources, you really want to choose complex carbohydrates primarily, right? And ideally, if you can, gluten-free. And this is a little controversial, but I found in my clinic, many of my patients tend to get low-level gut inflammation and or leaky gut syndrome with adding gluten to their diets, and they feel much better and they digest much better when they remove it. And you might want to try it too. And so basically gluten is a substance found in many wheat-containing carbohydrates, and you just check to make sure that they don't have them. Here are some things that are gluten-free that work really well: cream of rice, yams, wild rice, brown rice, jasmine rice, quinoa, beans, and legumes. These all could be of some utility for you. What about proteins? Well, ideally, when you choose protein sources, you want to choose, if they're animal sources, you want to choose the leanest cut and organic or grass-fed whenever possible. The idea behind it is many of the chemicals, pesticides, toxins, byproducts, plastics tend to reside in adipose tissue, and the less of that you consume from your animals is likely to be more healthful for you. And then if they're organic or grass-fed, they're less likely to ingest a lot of the processed meal that pigs, chickens, cows, whatever are fed in concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, right? And this is kind of a little bit concerning, but there is evidence to suggest that the quality of food that's fed to these animals is definitely suspect at best. But again, that's something that you can do your research on as well. But ideally, if you can go with leanest cut and organic and grass-fed, that would probably be your best bet. That would be your best bet. And so what are some sources that you would utilize? Chicken or turkey breast is very lean. Egg whites, lean cuts of red meat. I tend to prefer round or 96% fat-free ground beef and whey protein isolate. And then seafood is great, but just make sure to get wild caught and avoid larger fish, primarily due to mercury contamination, right? What about fats? Well, as we talked about, you want to avoid the trans fats, and you want to avoid the processed seed oils. So like safflower oil, corn oil, soybean oil. And instead, you want to try to utilize oils like olive oil, extra virgin olive oil. Less processed oils are better. MCT oil, macadamia nut oil, almonds, egg yolks, and avocados. Now, ideally, you want to avoid saturated fats found in chicken, pork, red meat, and turkey. And some individuals can't really tolerate these are saturated fats in egg yolks. Some individuals can't tolerate them, some can though. And egg yolks have a lot of other great nutrients like biotin, but check with see how it goes with your body and check your lipid profile. Some of my patients, it's very interesting when I add in egg yolks. Some patients tolerate very well. Other people, it just really raises their total cholesterol and LDL. So we just like not to utilize them. And then whatever you do, avoid processed seed oil. So corn oil, sesame seed oil, and canola oil. Okay, so hopefully that sheds some light on how to create macros and what foods to choose when you're creating your diet. It's what I kind of conveyed to my patients when they join the clinic, and hopefully it will allow you to make some healthier dietary choices that will result in an improved physique.